Mrs. Maria was standing in the confession line when the priest whispered something that froze her blood. "Before you confess your sins, I need to know, is your tithe up to date?" She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Her hands trembled as she held her old purse, where she kept only the counted money for her chemotherapy medications. The priest knew. Everyone in the church knew she was sick. But he continued, "Without a tithe, there is no confession." Tears burned her eyes. She was 72 years old, had advanced stage cancer, and now she couldn't even seek God's forgiveness. What happened next was even worse than she had imagined. Mrs. Maria had always been a woman of faith, one of those who woke up before sunrise to pray the rosary, who never missed Sunday Mass, who knew every corner of the small church of St. Anthony as if it were her own home. For 50 years, she occupied the same wooden bench in the third row on the left, from where she could see the altar perfectly and smell the incense mixed with the fresh flowers she herself brought every week. But the last 6 months had been different, very different. It all started with a stomachache that she ignored for weeks, thinking it was just gastritis, something that happens to those who eat poorly and too quickly. When she finally went to the health clinic, it was already too late. The doctor ordered tests, then more tests, then a biopsy. The word cancer fell upon her like a stone. Stomach cancer, advanced stage, expensive treatment, even more expensive medications. Mrs. Maria had lived alone since her husband passed away 10 years ago. Her retirement was one minimum wage. It was barely enough for food, electricity, water. Now she had to choose, eat or get treatment. And she chose to live, even if it hurt. Even if the tithe money, those 10% she always set aside religiously, now went to the pharmacy. "I never thought I would one day stop paying the tithe. Never. My mother taught me from a young age, Maria, God takes care of those who take care of his house. And I believed that with every fiber of my being. For 50 years I set aside that money before any other bill, before rent, before groceries, before everything. It was sacred. But when the doctor gave me the diagnosis, I felt my world collapse. Cancer, that word we always think will happen to others, never to us. And the treatment, my God, the treatment was so expensive. The medications I needed to take cost almost half of my retirement. How was I going to manage? I cried for 3 days straight, not out of fear of death. Death, I knew, was just a passage. But I cried because for the first time in my life, I would have to choose between God and my health. Or at least, that's what it seemed like. I talked to him at night, kneeling in my small room, with the image of Our Lady on the nightstand. "Lord, you know I have never failed to give what is yours, but now I need this money to stay alive, to be able to continue going to your house, to be able to continue praying, to be able to continue serving. Forgive me." I thought God would understand. I was sure he would understand. But things at church began to change. Father Henrique, who had taken over the parish 2 years ago, was not like the old priest. He was young, energetic, always talked about prosperity, about material blessings, about how God blesses those who are faithful. And faithfulness, according to him, was also measured by the tithe. At Masses, he began to talk more about money than about love, more about contribution than about compassion. There was even a list, yes, a list, with the names of tithers who were up to date, posted on the bulletin board at the church entrance. Those who were up to date received a gold sticker next to their name. Those who were behind, well, everyone could see. Mrs. Maria's name, which had always shone on that list, was now without the sticker, and people began to notice. First came the stares, then the whispers. Has she lost her faith? She must be spending on other things. In our day, we sacrificed for the church. Nobody asked if she was okay. Nobody asked why she was thinner, paler, more tired. They only saw the name without the sticker. Things got strange at church. Before, people greeted me, asked about me, talked after Mass. Now it was different. I felt the judgmental looks. Some ladies from the prayer group, my friends for decades, started treating me coldly. One day, Mrs. Lourdes, who always sat next to me, changed seats. She looked at me out of the corner of her eye and whispered to another, "Those who don't honor God's house don't deserve to be in it." That hurt more than chemotherapy. Much more. I wanted to scream, "I'm sick! I'm using the money to not die." But my throat closed up. I was ashamed. Ashamed of being sick, ashamed of not having money, ashamed of no longer being the exemplary Maria I had always been. But even so, I kept going to Mass, because my faith was greater than the judgment. Or at least I tried to believe that. 3 months passed. The treatment progressed, as did the disease. Mrs. Maria was losing weight, losing her hair, but not losing her devotion. Until one day, she felt an enormous weight in her chest. It wasn't the physical pain of the disease. It was something else. It was guilt. Guilt for not contributing. Guilt for feeling she was disappointing God. She decided she needed to confess. She needed to tell God, through the priest, how sorry she was for not being able to give the tithe. She needed relief. She needed forgiveness. On Wednesday afternoon, she dragged her weak body to the church. The confessional was empty, as it always was at that time. Father Henrique was there, sitting, waiting. She entered, knelt with difficulty, her joints aching, and began, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." "How long has it been since your last confession?" The priest's voice came from the other side of the screen, serious, professional. 3 months, Father." My voice came out trembling. 3 months. "Mrs. Maria, is that you?" "Yes, Father." There was a pause, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. I could hear his breathing from the other side of the screen. Then he spoke, with a voice that had nothing pastoral about it. "Mrs. Maria, before we continue, I need to know, is your tithe up to date?" My heart stopped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was asking me about money. In the confessional, I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. "Father, I'm going through difficulties. I'm sick and—" "Sick or not, Mrs. Maria, the church also has its needs. The tithe is a commitment to God. If you are not up to date, I cannot hear you in confession." The world collapsed at that moment. My hands trembled holding the rosary. I felt tears burn my eyes, but I tried to control myself. "But Father, I always paid. For 50 years I never missed. Now I have cancer, I need to buy medications, and faith is demonstrated especially in difficult times. Mrs. Maria, if you trust God, He will provide, but you need to first honor your commitment to His house. Come back when you are up to date." And with those words, the priest stood up and left the confessional, leaving me kneeling alone, crying in silence. I stayed there for long minutes, without the strength to get up, not understanding how that was possible. 50 years of faithfulness, 50 years of service. And now, when I needed consolation the most, I was rejected, not by God. I knew that, deep in my heart, but by the man who was supposed to represent Him. When I finally managed to get up from that confessional, my legs could barely support me. It wasn't just the weakness from the disease. It was something that came from within, a pain that no medicine could cure. I left the church staggering, holding onto the walls, and some people glanced at me, but nobody came to help me. Nobody asked if I was okay. The way home had never seemed so long. With each step, the priest's words echoed in my head. "Come back when you're up to date," as if God charged admission, as if mercy had a price. I got home and fell on the bed, still dressed. I lay staring at the cracked ceiling, at the moisture stain that formed something like a cloud, and I wondered, what did I do wrong? Where did I go wrong? Did God really care more about money than about my heart? Mrs. Maria spent the next few days in a state of torpor. She continued taking her medications, went to chemotherapy sessions at the health clinic, but there was something broken inside her. The faith that had always been her anchor now seemed like a burden. She could no longer pray without feeling a tightness in her chest. She could no longer look at images of saints without remembering the rejection she felt in that confessional. The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Teresa, who lived in the house next door, knocked on the door one Saturday morning. Maria, you didn't go to Mass last Sunday. Is everything okay? I wanted to tell her. I wanted to vent. But how do you explain that you were expelled from the confessional for not having money? How do you say that the church, which had always been your refuge, was now your wound? I'm just tired, Teresa. The treatment is heavy. That was all I could say. But Mrs. Teresa wasn't foolish. She had known Maria for 30 years, knew when something was wrong. Is it just tiredness, or is there something more? She entered without asking permission, the way old friends do, and sat in the kitchen chair. Talk to me, Maria. What happened? And then, for the first time, I broke down. I told her everything. The illness, the missing money, the overdue tithe, the rejection in the confessional. The words came out broken between sobs, and Mrs. Teresa listened to me in silence, with wide eyes, incredulous. He did what? Teresa stood up from the chair, indignant. That's absurd, Maria. You gave 50 years of your life to that church. You washed altar cloths, arranged flowers, made food for the celebrations, took care of everything. And now that you're sick, he turns his back on you because of money. But what if he's right, Teresa? What if I'm really failing God? My voice was weak, full of doubt. Failing God? Maria, listen to what I'm going to tell you. God doesn't need your money. God wants your heart. And if someone is failing here, it's not you. It's that priest who forgot what Jesus taught. Mrs. Teresa's words echoed in me, but the doubt still persisted. I was raised believing that priests were God's representatives on earth, that their words had divine weight. How could I simply ignore what he said? In the following days, the news spread. Mrs. Teresa, with all her indignation, told other neighbors, and they told others. Soon, half the neighborhood knew that Mrs. Maria had been rejected in confession for not paying the tithe. The reactions were varied. Some people were horrified. How absurd! She has cancer. Others defended the priest. The church has bills to pay too. If everyone stops contributing, how will it function? And there were those who simply didn't want to get involved. It's none of our business. This is between her and God. But the person who surprised Mrs. Maria the most was Mr. Benedito, the owner of the corner bakery. He was a simple man, evangelical, who always greeted everyone with a wide smile. When he heard the story, he went to Maria's house bringing fresh bread and an envelope. Mrs. Maria, I know we don't attend the same church, but I heard what happened, and that's not right. He placed the envelope on the table. Here's a little money. It's not much, but it should help with the medications. I looked at that envelope and the tears came again. But this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude. Mr. Benedito, I can't accept this. You barely know me, and I know enough. I know a woman of faith who is suffering, and Jesus taught us to help one another, not to judge. He smiled, squeezed my hand and left, leaving the envelope on the table. When I opened the envelope, there were 300 reais. It wasn't much, but for me, at that moment, it was everything. It was proof that kindness still existed, that compassion still existed, that God perhaps hadn't abandoned me. He was just showing me that he was in places I didn't expect. But the wound caused by Father Henrique still bled. Every time I passed in front of the church, my chest tightened. I avoided looking at the building, at the bell, at the door through which I had entered so many times with joy. Now that place only brought me pain. One night, I dreamed of my mother. She had passed away 15 years ago, but in the dream she was alive, young, wearing the same flowered dress she wore on Sundays. She held my hand and said, Maria, my daughter, God is not in the church walls. He is in your heart. Don't let a flawed man take that away from you. I woke up crying, but with a different feeling. It wasn't relief, it wasn't peace, but it was something like hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could find my way back to God, but it wouldn't be through that church. Not while that man was there. Meanwhile, Father Henrique continued his routine. At Masses, he preached about faithfulness, about commitment, about how God's blessings were proportional to the generosity of the faithful. He didn't mention Mrs. Maria, not once. To him, she was just another name on the list of defaulters, another administrative problem, but what he didn't know was that that decision, that moment when he chose money over compassion, would have consequences. Consequences he would never imagine. 2 weeks after the incident in the confessional, something unexpected happened. During Sunday Mass, Father Henrique made an announcement that left the congregation in silence. The diocese had approved a complete renovation of the church. New roof, restored benches, modern sound system, even air conditioning. The cost, 200,000 reais. Brothers and sisters, this is a blessing from God. His voice echoed through the microphone, excited. But we need everyone's collaboration. Each person must do their part. The faithful who are up to date with their tithe will receive priority in special celebrations. Those who are behind, well, we hope they recognize the importance of honoring their commitments. People applauded, some more enthusiastically, others embarrassed, but everyone understood the message. Those who didn't pay would be marked, would be excluded. Mrs. Teresa, who was sitting at the back of the church, felt her blood boil. She looked around, searching for Maria, but she wasn't there. She hadn't come for weeks, and Teresa understood perfectly why. When Mass ended, Teresa didn't leave immediately. She waited for most people to leave and then approached the priest, who was talking with some members of the parish council near the altar. "Father Henrique, may I speak with you for a moment?" He turned, smiling politely. "Of course, Mrs. Teresa. What can I do for you?" "It's about Mrs. Maria?" The smile wavered slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Maria. She hasn't been coming to Mass. I hope everything is okay with her." "Okay?" Teresa crossed her arms. "She has cancer, Father, spending all her retirement on medications, and you sent her away from confession because she couldn't pay the tithe." The atmosphere changed instantly. The parish council members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Father Henrique cleared his throat. "Mrs. Teresa, you weren't present. You don't know exactly what happened." "Yes, I do. Maria herself told me. Crying, distraued. 50 years of service, Father. 50 years. And you treat her as if she were just any debtor." "The church has its rules, Mrs. Teresa. I didn't invent them. The tithe is a sacred commitment and—" "Sacred commitment?" Teresa raised her voice, something rare for her. "Jesus didn't charge admission to heal the sick. He didn't charge to forgive sins. Do you really think he would approve of this?" The words fell like bombs. Some people who were still leaving the church stopped to listen. Father Henrique felt his face heat up. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in public. "Mrs. Teresa, let's talk in private." He tried to take her by the arm, but she pulled away. "No, this needs to be said. Here, now. This church is becoming a business, not a house of God, and if nobody has the courage to speak up, I will." And with that, Mrs. Teresa left, leaving an awkward silence behind. People whispered. The priest tried to laugh, downplay it, say it was a misunderstanding. But the seed of doubt had been planted. That afternoon at Mrs. Maria's house, she was lying on the couch, too weak to do anything. That week's chemotherapy had been particularly brutal. She could barely eat, could barely stay awake. But even in the fog of pain and fatigue, she thought about the church, thought about the priest, thought about how everything had gone wrong. The doorbell rang. With great effort, she got up and went to the door. On the other side was a young woman of about 25, with a notebook in her hands and a kind smile. "Mrs. Maria, my name is Julia. I'm a journalist from the local newspaper. I heard your story and would like to talk to you if you'll allow me." My heart raced. Journalist? How did she know? I hadn't told that many people. I don't know if it's a good idea. I don't want trouble." "I completely understand, Mrs. Maria. But your story is important. Many people go through the same thing. And sometimes, when we speak up, things can change." Julia had sincere eyes. Her voice was calm. She didn't seem to be there for sensationalism. She seemed to genuinely care. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to send her away, close the door, and pretend none of this was happening. But another part, Another part was tired of carrying this alone, tired of feeling ashamed for something that wasn't my fault. "Come in." We sat at the small kitchen table, and I told her everything, from the diagnosis to the rejection in the confessional. Julia wrote everything down, but sometimes she would stop just to listen to me, without writing anything. She held my hand when I cried. She wasn't just a journalist, she was a human being. "Mrs. Maria, do you authorize me to publish this story? Without your real name, if you prefer, but I think people need to know." I thought a lot before answering. I was afraid of the priest, afraid of the church, afraid of what people would think. But then I remembered Mrs. Teresa's words. "If someone is failing here, it's not you. You can publish it. With my real name, I have nothing left to lose anyway." 3 days later, the article was published. "Elderly woman with cancer rejected in confession for not paying tithe." The headline covered the front page of the local newspaper. Mrs. Maria's story was there, complete, detailed, moving, and the entire city read it. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The newspaper received dozens of calls, emails, comments on social media. Some people supported Mrs. Maria, outraged by the priest's attitude. Others defended the church, saying there were two sides to the story, but most were shocked, because deep down, everyone knew someone like Mrs. Maria. Everyone knew a person who gave themselves to the church and was forgotten when they needed help. The story didn't stay in the city. Within days, it was shared in social media groups, religious blogs, even radio programs began commenting on it. How far does tithing collection go? Church or business? Does mercy have a price? Father Henrique woke up one morning with dozens of messages on his cell phone. The parish secretary called, nervous. "Father, did you see the newspaper? Everyone is talking. The diocese called. They want an urgent meeting." He picked up the newspaper and read the article. With each word, he felt his stomach tighten. This was getting out of control. He tried to defend himself, said he was misinterpreted, that there were rules, that the church needed to sustain itself. But nobody wanted to hear justifications. People wanted answers. They wanted to know how a priest could reject a sick woman. And while the storm grew around Father Henrique, Mrs. Maria was at home, on the couch, watching the local news talk about her. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel revenge. She just felt tired. And one question hammered in her mind. Did I do the right thing? The diocese didn't take long to act. 2 days after the article was published, a representative of the bishop arrived at the parish of St. Anthony. Father Henrique was summoned to a closed meeting. He entered the room confident, prepared to defend himself, but the atmosphere was icy. "Father Henrique, do you have any idea of the embarrassment you've caused?" Monsignor Paulo, a 60-year-old man with grey hair and a deep voice, stared at him. "This story is everywhere. People are questioning not only you, but the entire church." "Monsignor, I only followed the guidelines about tithing. The diocese itself establishes that the guidelines talk about encouragement, Father." "Encouragement, not about rejecting a sick woman in the confessional." Monsignor Paulo's voice was loaded with indignation. "The sacrament of confession is for everyone, regardless of their financial situation. This is basic." Father Henrique felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. "But the church needs resources. If we don't collect, how will we keep everything running? I was just trying to be responsible." "Responsible?" Another priest present, Father Miguel, a younger man known for his work with the poor, intervened. "Responsible would be visiting this lady, offering support, perhaps even helping with medical expenses, not expelling her from the confessional." The silence that followed was deafening. Father Henrique knew he had lost. There was no argument that could save him now. "You will make a public retraction," said Monsignor Paulo categorically. "You will seek out Mrs. Maria, apologize personally, and you will completely review your practices regarding tithing. Is that clear?" "Yes, Monsignor." "And Father Henrique, this is a formal warning. If something like this happens again, your transfer will be inevitable." When the meeting ended, Father Henrique left the room with trembling hands. All his authority, all his confidence had crumbled. He would have to humble himself. He would have to admit he was wrong. And for someone who had always seen himself as infallible, this was devastating. Meanwhile, at Mrs. Maria's house, life had changed drastically. People she had never seen began to appear. Some brought food, others brought money. There was even an online fundraiser that had raised more than 10,000 reais to help with treatment. I didn't know how to react. Part of me was grateful, moved by so much solidarity, but another part felt exposed, vulnerable. My private life had become news. My pain had become public debate, and I wasn't sure I wanted that. "Maria, you did the right thing." Mrs. Teresa was sitting next to me, holding my hand. "How many other people go through the same thing and stay silent? You gave them a voice." "But what now, Teresa? I can't go back to that church anymore. That place that was my second home for 50 years. I lost that." "You didn't lose God, Maria. And in the end, that's all that matters." 2 days later, on a cloudy afternoon, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, my heart almost stopped. On the other side was Father Henrique. He looked smaller, more fragile. His eyes avoided mine. "Mrs. Maria, may I come in?" I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being screamed to close that door. But there was something in his posture, something broken, that made me step back and let him pass. We sat in the living room. The silence was heavy, awkward. He fidgeted with his hands, nervous, and I just waited. I came to apologize. His voice was low, almost inaudible. "I made a serious mistake, an unforgivable mistake. I let concern about the church's finances override my mission as a shepherd. And you didn't deserve that." I said nothing. I just looked at him. "I know there's no excuse for what I did. I know I hurt you deeply, and I know that a simple apology won't erase that. But I needed to say it personally. I was wrong, completely wrong." Tears began to stream down his face. And as much as I wanted to stay angry, as much as I wanted to scream everything I had felt, I couldn't, because deep down I saw a flawed man, a man who had made a terrible mistake and was now paying for it. "Father," my voice came out trembling, "you hurt me in a way I never imagined was possible. I felt abandoned by God because of your words. I spent sleepless nights wondering if I was still worthy of forgiveness." "Mrs. Maria, please, let me finish." I took a deep breath. "But I also know that we all make mistakes. We all fail, and if I learned anything from Jesus, it's that forgiveness is not optional. It's mandatory." He looked at me incredulous. "You are forgiving me?" "I'm trying to. It won't be easy. The wound is deep. But yes, Father, I forgive you." Father Enrique broke down in tears. He apologized more times than I could count, and when he finally stood up to leave, there was something different in the air. It wasn't relief. It wasn't peace. But it was a beginning. At the following Sunday Mass, the church was packed, not because people were faithful, but because they wanted to see what would happen. News of the public retraction had spread. Father Henrique climbed to the pulpit, clearly nervous. He cleared his throat, held the microphone firmly, and began, "Brothers and sisters, before we begin today's celebration, I need to talk about something very serious. Recently, I made a very serious mistake. I denied the sacrament of confession to one of our sisters, Mrs. Maria, because she was behind on her tithe due to medical treatment expenses." A murmur ran through the church. Some people already knew. Others were shocked. I was wrong, completely wrong. The sacrament of confession is a right of all the faithful, regardless of their financial situation. Jesus never charged anyone to listen, to forgive, to welcome. And I, as his representative, failed miserably. He paused, visibly emotional. "I publicly apologize to Mrs. Maria. I apologize to all of you who trusted me as a shepherd, and I ask God's forgiveness for having distorted his message of love and transformed his house into a place of collection." Some people cried, others remained silent, but everyone understood this was a rare moment, a moment when a religious leader publicly admitted his mistake. From today on, no member of this parish will be excluded from any sacrament for financial reasons. God's house is open to everyone, without exception. When Mass ended, something surprising happened. People began to approach the priest, not to criticize him, but to thank him. Thank him for his humility, for the courage to admit his mistake. And some confessed that they too had felt pressured by tithing, but had never had the courage to speak up. That day, something changed in the parish of St. Anthony. It wasn't a complete change. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. And in her home, watching everything on television because the Mass was covered by local media, Mrs. Maria cried. She cried with relief, with pain, with hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could return someday. Not immediately, not yet, but someday. 3 weeks passed since Father Enrique's public retraction. The city was slowly returning to its routine, but something fundamental had changed. People began to question things they had previously accepted blindly. They began to talk about faith in a different way, more human, less automatic. Mrs. Maria continued in treatment. The medications purchased with the money from the fundraiser were working. The doctors said there were signs of improvement, small but significant. She was eating better, sleeping better. Her body was still fragile, but hope had returned. But the question of the church still haunted her. She would pass in front of the building sometimes, when going to the market or the pharmacy, and would feel a tightness in her chest. That place had been her refuge for so long, and now it seemed like foreign territory. One afternoon, Mrs. Teresa showed up with an unusual proposal. "Maria, there's a prayer group that meets at Mrs. Francisca's house. It's small, just about 6 people. They invited me and I thought you might like it. There's no priest, no charges for anything. It's just people praying together." I hesitated. The idea of gathering with people to pray was tempting, but I was afraid of being judged again, afraid of not being enough. "Do they know my story?" "They do, and that's exactly why they asked me to invite you. They want to welcome you, Maria, truly." The following Saturday I went. Mrs. Francisca's house was simple but cozy. When I entered, there were 5 women sitting in the living room, all around my age. They stood up when they saw me and, one by one, hugged me, without questions, without judgments, just sincere hugs. "Welcome, Maria," said Mrs. Francisca, a chubby lady with kind eyes. "Here we pray, talk, cry, and laugh together. There's no formality, there's only love." We sat in a circle. Each one shared a bit about her week, her concerns, her joys. And when my turn came, I talked about the treatment, about how I was feeling better physically, but still emotionally wounded. "It's hard to understand how a place I loved so much now brings me so much pain," I confessed. One of the women, Mrs. Gloria, held my hand. "Maria, the church is made of people, and people fail. But God doesn't fail. He never abandoned you. Never." At that moment, something inside me broke, and I cried. I cried like I hadn't cried in weeks, and those women who barely knew me embraced me. Let me cry, let me be fragile. When I returned home that night, I felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Meanwhile, at the parish of St. Anthony, Father Enrique was going through his own transformation. The public retraction hadn't been easy. He lost the respect of some people. Some members of the parish council asked for transfers to other churches. But he also gained something he didn't expect: humility. He began to visit the sick of the parish, something he previously delegated to volunteers. He went from house to house, talked, listened to stories, offered prayers, and with each visit he understood a little more the magnitude of his mistake. On one of these visits, he met Mr. Manuel, an 80-year-old man bedridden with Alzheimer's. His wife, Mrs. Gloria, the same one from the prayer group, took care of him alone. The house was humble, almost falling apart. "Father, thank you for coming," said Mrs. Gloria, offering a weak coffee in a cracked cup. "It's been a while since we've had a visit from the church." "How long, Mrs. Gloria?" "About 2 years, more or less. After we stopped being able to pay the tithe, the visits became rarer, until they stopped." Father Henrique felt a punch in his stomach. This was happening while he was there. People were being forgotten because they couldn't contribute financially. Mrs. Gloria, I'm so sorry. This shouldn't have happened. She smiled, a tired smile, but without bitterness. Things are what they are, Father, but now you're here, and that's already a lot. When Father Enrique left that house, he was different. He understood that Mrs. Maria's case wasn't isolated. It was symptomatic of something much bigger. The church had distanced itself from people. It had become too institutional, too bureaucratic, too financial. He decided to change that, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. At the next parish council meeting, he presented a proposal: create an aid fund for needy families in the parish, financed by voluntary donations. Nothing mandatory, nothing charged, just solidarity. But Father, what if people stop contributing? One of the council members, Mr. Alberto, a successful businessman, asked worriedly. What if the church runs out of resources? Then we'll live with less, Mr. Alberto. But at least we'll live according to what we preach. The proposal was approved by majority, and at Sunday Mass, Father Enrique announced the creation of the St. Anthony Solidarity Fund. The response was immediate. People who had stopped contributing returned to donate, not out of obligation, but by choice, because now they knew the money would help those who really needed it. In the following weeks, the fund helped 5 families. It paid for medications, bought food, renovated houses, and the news spread. The parish of St. Anthony, which had been stained by the tithe scandal, was now recognized for its solidarity. But Father Henrique knew something was still missing. He needed to talk to Mrs. Maria again, not to apologize more, he had already done that, but to invite her back, to show that the church had changed, or at least was trying to. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, he knocked on Mrs. Maria's door. When she opened it, the surprise was evident on her face. "Father, what are you doing here?" "Mrs. Maria, I know I've already apologized, and I know I have no right to ask anything after what I did, but I wanted to tell you about some things that have been happening at the parish." She hesitated, but opened the door. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she had talked with the journalist weeks ago, and Father Henrique told her everything. The Solidarity Fund, the visits to needy families, the changes in the church's practices. "I realized, thanks to you, that I had lost focus. I had forgotten that a church isn't a building, it's a community, and a community takes care of one another." I listened in silence. Part of me wanted to believe the change was real. But the wound was still there, throbbing. "Father, I appreciate you telling me this, truly, but I don't know if I can go back. Not yet. I understand, and I didn't come here to pressure you. I came only to say that when, or if, you want to return, the door will be open, always." He stood up to leave, but before going out, he turned one more time. "Mrs. Maria, you taught me more about faith in these last few weeks than all the years of seminary. Thank you for that." And he left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. And for the first time in a long time, I seriously considered the possibility of returning. The days passed, and Mrs. Maria's routine began to gain a new rhythm. The prayer group at Mrs. Francisca's house became her weekly refuge. There, she wasn't the woman who was rejected. She wasn't the viral story. She was just Maria, a woman of faith trying to find her way back to God. But life had other surprises in store. One Monday morning, she received an unexpected call. It was Julia, the journalist who had published her story. "Mrs. Maria, good morning. How are you?" "I'm fine, dear. And you?" "Look, I called because I received a very interesting message. A production company from São Paulo wants to make a documentary about stories of faith and overcoming, and they want to include your story. Would you be interested?" My heart raced. Documentary. My story on a national scale. It was scary and at the same time intriguing. "Julia, I don't know. It was already very difficult to expose my life once. To do it again, on a larger level. I completely understand, Mrs. Maria. But think about it. How many people could benefit from hearing your story? How many Mariahs are out there suffering in silence? She was right. I knew she was. But the fear was still great. Let me think about it, okay? I'll call you in a few days. Of course, no pressure. If you need anything, I'm here. When I hung up, I stood staring at the phone. Should I do this? Did I have the strength to relive everything again? I talked to Mrs. Teresa, to the women in the prayer group, even to Mr. Benedito from the bakery. Everyone had different opinions. Some thought it was an opportunity. Others thought I should preserve my peace. In the end, the decision was mine. It took me 3 days to decide. And on a Wednesday afternoon, I called Julia. You can give my contact to the production company. I accept. Meanwhile, at the parish of St. Anthony, the fruits of change were beginning to appear. The Solidarity Fund had already helped 15 families. The masses were fuller, not because people were obligated, but because they wanted to be there. The atmosphere was different, more welcoming, more human. Father Henrique had become another person. He visited the sick regularly, knew the families' stories, cried with them, laughed with them. He had rediscovered what it meant to be a true shepherd, but not everything was rosy. There was resistance. Mr. Alberto and other more conservative council members were dissatisfied. The church is becoming social assistance, they complained. We're losing our identity. At a particularly tense meeting, Mr. Alberto confronted the priest directly. Father Enrique, with all due respect, but the numbers don't lie. Collections have dropped 20% since you changed the policies. How are we going to keep the church running? Monetary collections may have dropped, Mr. Alberto, but the collection of souls has increased. And isn't that worth more? Souls don't pay bills, Father. True, but if our concern is only paying bills, then we've become a business, not a church. The silence that followed was heavy. Some council members agreed with the priest, others with Mr. Alberto. The division was clear. In the end, it was Mrs. Francisca, who had been invited to join the council recently, who broke the silence. I understand Mr. Alberto's concern. It's valid. But do you remember why we're here? When this church was founded 80 years ago, it was just a wooden shed. People gathered because they wanted to be close to God, not because the building was beautiful. Maybe we need to remember that. Mrs. Francisca's words echoed, and gradually the tension diminished. It wasn't completely resolved. Issues like this never are, but at least dialogue was open. 2 weeks later, the documentary team arrived in town. There were 4 people, a director, a producer, a cinematographer, and an assistant. They stayed at the only inn in town and began filming. When they arrived at my house with all those cameras and equipment, I almost gave up. It was intimidating. But the producer, a woman named Fernanda, was very kind. Mrs. Maria, you don't need to do anything but be yourself. We'll talk as if it were a normal chat, okay? And that's exactly what we did. We sat in the living room with the camera on, and I told my story once more. From the diagnosis to the rejection, through the priest's retraction and my journey of healing, not just of the body, but of the soul. I cried several times. Fernanda did too. And when we finished, hours later, I felt liberated, as if that account had taken something heavy out of me. You're an incredible woman, Mrs. Maria, said Fernanda, turning off the camera. Your story will touch many lives. They also interviewed Mrs. Teresa, Mr. Benedito, Julia, and even Father Henrique. Yes, the priest agreed to be interviewed, and in that interview, he didn't try to justify himself. He didn't try to minimize the mistake. He simply admitted, in front of the cameras, that he had failed and that he was trying to be better. I made a mistake that will haunt me for the rest of my life, he said, visibly emotional. But I choose to use that mistake as a learning experience. I choose to be a better priest, a better human being. And when filming ended 3 days later, the team said goodbye. The documentary will air in 2 months, said Fernanda. We'll send you a copy beforehand. And with that, they left, leaving the town a little more stirred up than when they arrived. That night, alone at home, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened in recent months. I had gone through rejection, public exposure, pain, anger, But I had also gone through solidarity, forgiveness, transformation. And I realized something. I was no longer the same Maria. The illness had weakened me physically but strengthened me emotionally. I had learned that faith isn't about rituals or institutions. It's about connection. Connection with God, connection with people, connection with yourself. The following Saturday I went to the prayer group as always, but this time I brought a proposal. Girls, I was thinking, what if we did something beyond praying? What if we visited sick people like I was visited? What if we made a chain of solidarity? Everyone's eyes sparkled. I think it's a wonderful idea, said Mrs. Gloria. And so Chain of Love was born. A small group of women dedicated to visiting the sick, bringing food, offering company. It wasn't connected to any church. It had no rules. It had no charges. It was just love in action. The first person we visited was Mr. Manuel, the gentleman with Alzheimer's that Father Henrique had mentioned. Mrs. Gloria almost cried when she saw us arrive with meals, cleaning products, and a smile on our faces. You don't know how much this means, she said, hugging each one of us. Yes, we do, I replied, because I've been on the other side, and at that moment I understood that my pain hadn't been in vain. It had generated transformation, not just in me, not just in the church, but in an entire community. And that, somehow, made it all worthwhile. 2 months passed like a breath. Winter arrived, bringing with it colder nights and mornings covered in fog. Mrs. Maria continued her treatment, and the doctors were optimistic. The tumor had decreased significantly. It wasn't a cure, not yet, but it was hope. And hope, sometimes, is all we need. The chain of love had grown. From 6 women, they had grown to 15. They visited not only the sick, but also lonely elderly people, single mothers who needed support, needy children. The initiative had even gotten an article in the same newspaper that published Mrs. Maria's original story. Women transform pain into solidarity. That was the headline, and when I read that, I felt a pride I had never felt before. Not pride in myself, but in what we had built together. But there was something that still bothered me. A wound that, although it was healing, still hurt when touched. The church. I hadn't gone back. Not once. I would pass in front and look away. I would hear the bells ringing on Sundays and my chest would tighten. Mrs. Teresa noticed. Maria, you know you don't have to go back if you don't want to, right? Nobody will judge you. I know, but there's a part of me that wants to, that misses it. You know that smell of incense? That silence before Mass begins? I miss that. Then go back, even if it's just to see how you feel. I promised I would think about it. But every time I imagined myself entering that church, my heart would race and my hands would sweat. The trauma was real, and trauma doesn't heal with willpower. It was then that I received a call from Fernanda, the documentary producer. Mrs. Maria, the documentary is ready. It's airing next week on a national streaming platform. I wanted you to see it first. Can I send you the link? Of course, dear. I'd love to. That night, alone in the living room with only the television light illuminating the space, I watched the documentary. It was titled Faith in Difficult Times and was 50 minutes long. My story was the main one, but there were 2 others. Of a man who lost his family in an accident and found faith through volunteer work, and of a young woman who overcame drug addiction through spirituality. Seeing my story told that way was surreal. There were images of the city, the church, my house. There were excerpts from my interview, interspersed with statements from Mrs. Teresa, Mr. Benedito, Father Henrique. The editing was sensitive, careful, moving. When it got to the part about the priest's retraction, I cried, because even after everything, seeing that man publicly admit his mistake still touched me deeply. And at the end of the documentary, there was a scene I didn't expect. It was me and the women from Chain of Love visiting Mr. Manuel. The camera had captured the moment when Mrs. Gloria hugged us, grateful, and over that image, my voice, I learned that faith isn't in the buildings. It's in the people. And when people unite with love, miracles happen. I turned off the television and sat in the dark for a long time. That documentary was the closing of a cycle. It was my story, told in the most honest way possible. And now, thousands of people were going to see it. The following week was a whirlwind. The documentary was released on a Friday, and by the weekend, it had already gone viral. It wasn't just critical success, it was public success. People watched, shared, commented. My story was everywhere. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists wanting interviews, television programs wanting to invite me, even publishers wanting to publish a book. It was overwhelming. I, a 72-year-old retired woman with cancer, had become some kind of symbol. "Mrs. Maria, you've become a celebrity. Mrs." Teresa joked while we had coffee in my kitchen. "Celebrity, no. I'm just an old woman who went through a difficult situation and survived. An old woman who inspired thousands of people. That's not insignificant, Maria." But along with the recognition also came criticism. It always does. Some people said I was taking advantage of the situation to gain fame. Others said I had exaggerated the story. And there were those who fiercely defended Father Henrique, saying he didn't deserve to be exposed that way. I tried not to read the negative comments, but it's hard not to read when they appear in front of you. One night, after reading a particularly cruel comment, I broke down. I called Julia, the journalist. "Julia, I don't know if I did the right thing. There are people hating me, saying horrible things. Mrs. Maria, there will always be people like that. But for every person who criticizes you, there are 10 who were touched by your story. Focus on them." And she was right, because along with the criticism also came beautiful messages, people telling me they had gone through similar situations, others saying they had started believing in human goodness again, some even saying they had sought medical treatment after watching the documentary. One message in particular marked me. It was from a 45-year-old woman named Carla. "Mrs. Maria, I had deep depression, thinking about giving up, but I saw your documentary and realized that if you could survive all that, I can survive too. Thank you for existing." When I read that, I cried. I cried because I understood that my pain, my exposure, my vulnerability had saved someone, and that made everything worthwhile. It was then that I made a decision I had been postponing for months. I was going back to church, not because I had to go back. Not because someone was demanding it, but because I wanted to, because it was time to face that fear. I told the girls from the prayer group. They were moved. "We'll go with you, Maria. You won't be alone." The following Sunday, for the first time in 4 months, I put on my mass dress, the same light blue dress I had worn for years. It was a bit loose. I'd lost a lot of weight with treatment, but it still fit. Mrs. Teresa, Mrs. Francisca, and 5 other women from the group came to pick me up. We walked together in silence, each one immersed in her own thoughts. When we arrived in front of the church, I stopped. My legs were shaking. My heart was beating so hard, I was sure the others could hear it. "You can do it, Maria," whispered Mrs. Teresa, holding my hand. I took a deep breath and took the first step. The church was packed, more packed than I remembered, and when I entered, something unexpected happened. People began to look at me, and then, one by one, they began to stand up. Not to expel me, not to judge me, but to applaud me. The applause started low, timid, and grew, until the entire church was standing, applauding. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. Tears streamed down my face. And up front, near the altar, Father Henrique was also standing. He wasn't applauding, he was just crying. And at that moment, our eyes met. And there was something there, something of reconciliation, something of mutual forgiveness, something of a new beginning. The applause lasted what seemed like an eternity, but it was probably just a few minutes. When it finally stopped, I was still in the center aisle, paralyzed, holding Mrs. Teresa's hand tightly. People began to sit down, but many still looked at me with encouraging smiles, some with tears in their eyes. I walked slowly to my pew, Third row on the left, the same place where I sat for 50 years. And when I settled there, it was as if something inside me finally clicked into the right place. I was home. Father Henrique went up to the pulpit to begin Mass. He cleared his throat, visibly emotional, and began, "Brothers and sisters, before we start our celebration, I need to say something. Today is a very special day, because today one of our dearest sisters has come home." He looked directly at me. "Mrs. Maria, your presence here today is a blessing, not just for me, but for all of us. You taught us about forgiveness, about strength, about true faith, and on behalf of this entire community, I say, welcome back." The entire church responded, "Amen." And then Mass began. But it wasn't a Mass like the others. There was something different in the air, something of renewal, of hope, of genuine community. People weren't there just out of obligation or tradition. They were there because they wanted to be, because they believed that space had once again become a place of welcome. During the homily, Father Henrique spoke about the parable of the prodigal son, but he gave a different interpretation. We always look at this parable thinking about the son who left and returned. But what if we look at the father who waited, the father who forgave, the father who celebrated the return? He paused, looked at the congregation. But what if I tell you that sometimes we are the ones responsible for driving people away? That sometimes we are the ones who need to ask for forgiveness and wait for them to return? This church drove people away. I drove people away. And today, one of them had the courage to return. And I, as father of this community, celebrate this return with all my heart. Many people cried during that homily. I cried. Mrs. Teresa cried. Even Mr. Alberto, the council member who always complained, was discreetly wiping his eyes. When Mass ended, I didn't run out as I had planned. I stayed, and dozens of people came to greet me, hug me, apologize for not having supported me when I needed it. It was overwhelming, but in a good way, in a healing way. Mrs. Lourdes, the one who had judged me and changed seats weeks ago, approached with red eyes. "Maria, forgive me. I was cruel, insensitive. I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask, Lourdes. But I forgive you, from my heart." And we hugged, a long, sincere hug that healed wounds we didn't even know existed. When the church finally began to empty, Father Henrique approached. "Mrs. Maria, may I have a moment with you?" "Of course, Father." We sat on her pew, side by side, in silence for a few moments, until he spoke. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to completely forgive myself for what I did. But you gave me a gift I didn't deserve, a second chance. Father, we all deserve second chances. Jesus gave countless ones. Who are we not to give them? You are wise, Mrs. Maria, wiser than many theologians I've met." I laughed. "Wisdom doesn't come from books, Father. It comes from living, from suffering, from getting back up." We talked for a few more minutes about the church, about the changes, about the future. And when I stood up to leave, he held my hand. "Thank you for not giving up on us." "I didn't give up on God, Father. I just needed to find him outside these walls for a while." In the following weeks, my life gained a new balance. I returned to attending church regularly, but also continued with the prayer group and the chain of love. I discovered that you can have both, that institution and personal spirituality don't need to be mutually exclusive. The documentary continued to be successful. I received invitations to give lectures, participate in podcasts, even write a book. I accepted some, declined others. I learned that I don't need to say yes to everything, that preserving my peace is more important than any exposure. And most importantly, my treatment was working. The last test showed that the tumor had reduced by 70%. The doctors used the word remission. It wasn't a definitive cure. Cancer never is. But it was a victory, a great victory. "Mrs. Maria, you are a miracle," said Dr. Fernanda, my oncologist. "I'm not a miracle, doctor. I'm just a woman too stubborn to give up." 6 months after my return to church, something extraordinary happened. The diocese announced that Father Enrique had been invited to give lectures in other parishes about pastoral renewal and welcoming. My story, our story, had become a case study, not just of failure, but of redemption. And more, the chain of love was officially recognized by the diocese as a lay ministry. We gained institutional support, but maintained our autonomy. It was the best of both worlds. On a Saturday afternoon, while we were preparing food baskets to distribute, Mrs. Francisca commented, "Maria, who would have thought that from all that pain so many good things would be born? Yeah, right. Sometimes God allows us to go through the valley just to teach others the way back." At that moment, I looked around. I saw women of different ages, from different backgrounds, united by a common purpose, to serve. And I thought about how it all started. With a rejection, with deep pain, with a wound that seemed incurable. But the wound had healed. It left a scar, yes, scars always do, but that scar was now a reminder that we are stronger than we imagine, that faith is not the absence of doubt, but persistence despite it, that institutions are made of people, and people can change. Father Henrique changed, I changed, the church changed, and the community changed. It wasn't perfect. It never is. There were still challenges, there were still conflicts, there were still difficult moments. But there was something that wasn't there before: authenticity. The church had returned to being what it should have been from the beginning, a place of welcome, not of collection, a space of love, not of judgment. A community, not a business. And I, Mrs. Maria, a 72-year-old woman cancer survivor, rejected and redeemed, was finally at peace. Not because everything had worked out, but because I had learned that peace doesn't come from circumstances. It comes from within. It comes from the certainty that no matter what happens, God is there, sometimes in expected places, sometimes in completely unexpected places, but always, always present. And that certainty no one could take from me, never again. And you, have you gone through a situation where you were unfairly judged? Have you ever felt that the institution that should welcome you rejected you? Leave your story in the comments. Let's create a chain of support and show that no one is alone on this journey. If this story touched your heart, leave your like, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that will make you reflect on faith, humanity, and forgiveness. Remember, true faith is not in church walls. It is in people's hearts, and your heart, just like Mrs. Maria's, is capable of extraordinary things. See you in the next video. Stay with God.